Farrow was born in the tiny Cambridgeshire village of Swaffham Prior on the 13th of May 1880. It's not grown very much in the intervening 100 years. It's still a small country village, now a commuter sort of dormitory town, really. It's still dominated by two twin churches that have been there hundreds of years old. There tends to be a feature of places where there were two manors competing, and each of the lords of the manor be trying to outdo each other by building the best church. So these churches are rather large and must have been quite empty, with half the village attending one and the other half attending the other. He came from a large family. His dad was an agricultural labourer. Both his parents had grown up in the village. They lived on the main street. Most of his siblings were baptised in the parish church of St Mary's. He and just one of his brothers and sisters are the only ones that don't seem to have been. Now, that might have been because the family occasionally had to move with his dad's work, and they went to Suffolk, near Mildenhall, when he was very young. And he returned when he was still very young, probably just in time to start school in the village. When he grew up, became a teenager, he joined the army. It was a desperate time for the British. We were fighting the Boer War. He joined up very near the beginning, in February of 1900. The British had just suffered a series of disastrous reverses, 3 defeats in a week, called it the Black Week. And he was probably one of many patriotic young men that flocked to recruiting offices to join up at that time. They didn't know it at that time, but just within a fortnight, we would have won a major victory at Paardeberg. And after that, the tide of the war definitely turned in our favour. And by the time he went out to South Africa to fight, the conventional war was all but over. He was in the 2nd Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. And after South Africa, they moved to the East Indies, what's now Myanmar, and what we called Burma before there, on the frontier between India and China. And they were there for about 6 years or so before they returned home. He signed up for 12 years with the army, as all young men did then, and he would have been, as they called, with the colours for 7 years, so actually in full-time service for 7 years, and then in reserve for 5 years. And so he came home, left his full-time role with the army and became a reservist. Like many ex-military men, he joined the asylum on Banstead Downs as an attendant, as a male nurse there. And while he was there, as must have happened so many times, he met a single female nurse, and Edith Mary Hibling, and they both got married. Now, that meant instant dismissal for Edith, because you were not allowed to work as a nurse, and indeed in a range of other occupations if you were married. And so she lost her job, unfortunately. But Mark carried on working at the asylum. The pay was reasonable, the hours were okay, he got 2 meals a day thrown in, and benefits to pay towards his accommodation as well. They very probably took a house in Belmont. He had a brother that was living there and also working at the asylum, but unfortunately we don't know quite where they lived. He is, however, commemorated on the Belmont War Memorial. Now, they'd married his wife Edith. She was a Sussex girl, so they'd married down in New Haven, and she returned to New Haven after the war, so she obviously still had strong family connections down there. They didn't have any children, and Mark joined up early in the war. The London County Council encouraged all their employees to join up. They continued to pay their salary to their dependents, and they kept their jobs open for them. So for the younger men or the older veterans who didn't have particularly strong family ties, they didn't have young children, most of them joined up very early in the war, and he was one of them. As a Boer War veteran, he was much in demand for the British Army. We had 1 million new volunteers for Lord Kitchener's new army, and they all needed to be trained. And it was these former NCOs of the army that fought in the Boer War that did a lot of that training. And he'd been a lance corporal. So he remained on the home front, probably as a lance corporal or maybe a corporal, training men probably for 2 years in the 3rd Battalion, the Reserve Battalion of the Devonshires. They were down in Exeter at first and then in Devonport. But at some point in early 1916, maybe he lost his stripe, or maybe he requested a posting where there was actually something happening, and he went to France sometime in early 1916. He rejoined his old battalion, the 2nd Battalion, and he fought with them on the first day of the Somme. They were at Ypres, a place that we come back to many times in our stories, although we've never talked about the first day around there. The men of the Devonshires, while the final hour of bombardment was going on, the men of the Devonshires left their trenches. They crept into no man's land, and they got as close as they could to the German line. They were about 100 yards away, so as soon as the barrage lifted, they could get up and they could run for the German line, rush them, and get in amongst them. Well, the barrage stopped, and they were close enough, they could have made it, but the German machine gun positions were extremely well defended. They hadn't been knocked out by the barrage. In many of their positions, they had lifts, they'd shelter underground, and they had lifts which would carry the gun and its whole team straight up so that they were in position within less than a minute of the barrage ceasing. And that's what happened. The machine guns cut them down almost immediately. They started running. Sometime later, the commanding officer of the Devons looked out from the British trenches, and he could still see his men dead and wounded in perfect wave formation laid out in no man's land. Only a handful of men made it to the German wire, and they never came back. They were withdrawn from the Somme battlefield after that to recuperate, but they returned later that year in the winter, and they fought in actions in early 1917 as the Germans started to retreat towards the Hindenburg, and the British and French pursued them. After that, they stayed on the Somme region while other units were fighting at Arras, and then they went up to Ypres, and they took part in the Third Battle of Ypres, which we all know probably better as Passchendaele. And they fought on the first day of that battle too, on the high ground, the strategically important Gellivelt plateau. They were attacking along the railway that ran from Ypres to Rouleur, and they were advancing as part of the first wave of troops that were going off. And their job was to capture the German frontline trench system, 3 trenches, one after the other, and then get to the German second line from where other troops would leapfrog them, and then later in the day they in turn were supposed to leapfrog them and carry on to the third line of objectives. The German positions were very well entrenched. They're very well defended, lots of concealed pillboxes in that area. The 3 main German defensive lines all converged in that area, so there was a very heavy concentration of defences and of troops. They got through the front lines okay. The Germans were happy to let them do that. They graded their defence in depth, so they had fewer men in the front line and more as you went further back. And their strategy was very much a counter-attacking one. They'd open the door, let the British in, shut the door with a barrage behind them, and then counter-attack with these vast formations of counter-attacking troops waiting in echelon. And that's exactly what happened on that day. The Devonshires made their objectives and they hung on to them. They tried to support the battalions that leapfrogged them, and they got so far, but they didn't quite reach the objectives for the day. On the whole, the British did okay on the first day. They got about halfway to their 2-day offensive that was going to take them to the little village of Passchendaele. It would take them another 98 days in the end to get there. Torrential rain fell in the evening, and it brought an end to the offensive temporarily. A lot of these troops were then withdrawn. They suffered very bad casualties, and we tend to see with our men that they come back in, say, September or October to make more attacks. But Mark and the Devonshires, they stayed in and around the front line there, and it wasn't long before they were back in action, and on the 16th of August, they came to finish what they started, in effect, and they tried to advance to the 3rd German line. They managed to get into the 3rd German line before they were then beaten back by a sound German defence. After that, they played no more part in the Third Battle of Ypres, and they went to a much quieter sector of the line. They rested, they trained, reinforcements arrived, and it wasn't until November that they returned to Ypres. And at that time, they were at Passchendaele. The village had fallen. Canadians took it on the 6th of November, and this was about a fortnight later that the Devonshires were manning the line around there on the ridge around the village. They took part in operations to extend the line there, although the battle itself had come to an end. There were still all these minor local actions being fought, and they gained a very favourable position for the British, which had observation uninterrupted for hundreds of yards on the other side of the ridge, and earned commendations for doing so. Cold, horrible winter, but thankfully they missed most of it because they were in training camp for about 6 weeks or so, and they had Christmas dinners, played football, all the sorts of things that they like to do. Lots of football, lots of rugby, lots of cricket in the summer. Football was officially part of the physical training programme, which was handy because the men absolutely loved playing. After Christmas Day and Boxing Day, they packed up, prepared to return to the trenches, which they then did so. They were resting when the Germans launched the first of their major spring offensive on the 21st of March. They sent their best troops against the British. They had a lightning bombardment before this attack took place. They attacked with the element of surprise. The bombardment lasted a few hours. It was extremely intense. It reduced the defences to matchsticks. The Germans sent their best troops through. They found the weak points in the British line, infiltrated through it, and left other troops to deal with the survivors, these little groups of men that were still clinging on. The very thinly stretched British Fifth Army started to retreat, falling back and fighting withdrawal towards the River Somme and beyond. The Devonshires were in camp at the time. They weren't in the front line, but the very next day after that attack was launched, they were put on a train and sent south. And they held positions overlooking a crossing over the Somme, the village of Brie, very important one. Men of the Fifth Army were still flooding through as they arrived, and the Germans were hot on their heels. And they had to fight defensive actions on the banks of the Somme, just 2 days later. They then were caught up in this pell-mell tumult of a retreat backwards, fighting actions every single day as they withdrew, sometimes counter-attacking, losing heavily as they went. All kinds of reserves, all the men from battalion HQs, all your tailors and shoemakers and all these kinds of men that wouldn't be expected to be in the front line had to be scrambled to plug gaps in the line. A very makeshift and improvised defence was arranged, but we were falling back on Amiens, this vital railway hub we had to protect, and because it had been so important, not just in 1918 but in previous years, there were good sets of defences already there. And so we fell back into these good sets of defences. We shortened our supply lines. We were right by the major railway hubs, so we actually found ourselves in a much better position than we had been when the attack started in the first place. The Germans conversely found themselves with a big bulge in the line to hold with extra men, and they suffered heavy casualties as we had, and their men were demoralised by the fact that they'd advanced all this way, but they still hadn't broken the British Army's fighting spirit. They were particularly demoralised, apparently, by these generous caches of supplies of tinned food and things like that they found, that we just abandoned as we went. Many of them were extremely hungry and very poorly supplied at that time. So we stopped the Germans at Amiens. They tried to attack again. The Devonshires fought, holding off one of their attacks. And they stayed in the Amiens area through most of April. Now, they were worn out. They suffered a lot of casualties. Reinforcements arrived, and they were practically a whole new battalion. Mark Farrow was still with them. As far as we know, he wasn't wounded at all in that time. He must have been with them almost all of that time. And they were sent off for a rest cure, a nice quiet stretch of the line between Soissons and Rheims, a stretch of the line which had been heavily contested in 1916 and 1917, but had been quiet for all of 1918. There were still trees there, still bushes. It was a pleasant stretch of countryside. It's not this shell desolated craterscape that we think of when we think of Passchendaele or somewhere like that. It was a pleasant place. It was very, very quiet. The sun was shining. It was nice and warm. It was a very pleasant change. Now, they were under French command, so French officers had to instruct them and retrain them. All these things they'd learned, which SOS signals do I send up, which hand grenades are they using, all these things changed. And so it was probably fortunate that a lot of men were new and they were not relearning this stuff, they were learning a lot of it for the first time. So the British troops, 12 divisions of them, were put into the line under French command along the River Aisne. It's a strategically important series of hills called the Chemin des Dames, which took their name from a road. The Chemin des Dames means the way of the ladies, and apparently named after one of the King Louis's daughters who used to go off down the road to wherever it was they were going. So there's a strategically important range of hills which guard the way to Paris, and the British troops were asked to hold them. Now, the British had experienced how to... They'd learned chastening lessons in defeat in defence at Ypres in the previous year and in March, and so they knew what they were doing and what they were talking about when it came to defence, and the British officers recommended that we should hold the northern side of the River Aisne with outposts, and then the bulk of our forces should be on the southern bank, where the heights commanded all the approaches to the rivers, and the machine guns would be able to stop the Germans, and we'd have enough time to then blow the crossings once the men in the outposts had fallen back. Unfortunately, this advice wasn't followed, and a less experienced French commander who was in charge insisted on heavily manning the front line, effectively putting most of our troops into the danger zone, the very first point that the Germans were going to reach. They had a quiet spell in the line, but it was noticeable that there was an increasing amount of activity going on, shelling increasing, the Germans trying to raid our trenches, whereas previously they'd left us alone. And then after being withdrawn for a few days' rest, a call came through that intelligence had interrogated 2 prisoners who were telling them that the Germans were about to attack the following day with 35 divisions in that area defended by 12 British divisions. So quite considerable force about to be unleashed. As soon as that news came through, troops scrambled to the front line and the Devonshires got the call to go. So 100 years ago today, in the afternoon, they received their orders and marched up to the front line. They crossed the River Ain and went to a long, sort of 30-metre high, quite long, thinly stretched hillock with 2 peaks, slightly wooded still, and crisscrossed with all these old trenches from fighting that had been taking place over the last couple of years. And they were told that this area, they were holding the Boer War, the wood of mounds, because it was quite lumpy in places. They were told that they had to hold this to the last man because it was absolutely vital on that particular part of the front. It guarded crossings over the River Ain behind it. Holding it as long as possible would slow the Germans down. And so with those orders, they arrived in the Boer War at about midnight. Now, the men were given their dispositions. They were shown which shelters that they were to shelter in. They had massive dugouts there that could hold an entire company full of men in good condition, all lit by electric lights, plenty of other shelters around. The trenches were an absolute maze. They'd accumulated over the last 2 years in no particular order, and the men, having arrived in the dark, were completely unfamiliar with them. But the commanding officer made his dispositions as best he could. He agreed with his company commanders where they'd go, and they were all just sharing a glass of whiskey and wondering whether this was just another wind-up and that nothing was going to happen when they heard the thud of 2 gas shells landing nearby, almost immediately followed by high explosive shells. This enormous, mighty roar was unleashed as the German guns started pouring shells into the Boer War and indeed all along the line. Everyone took shelter and waited for the bombardment to cease. This it did at about 3:30 in the morning when the infantry assault began. The Germans were once again attacking with the aid of mist. They seemed to do this every time, and some British officers commented it was almost supernatural, the way that they could conjure up this mist whenever they needed it. And so these stormtroopers, these elite troops, did exactly what they'd done in March. They approached the British front lines, which had been decimated by this intense hurricane bombardment. They found the weak spots and they went through them, and it was only about half an hour later, when they were through the front line, that they reached the 2nd Devonshires in support on the Boer War. At 4 a.m, the Devonshires came out of their bunkers, and they were just taking their dispositions when they first came into contact with the Germans. They'd barely had time to deploy, and they were immediately involved in a fight. It wasn't long before they realised that they were completely surrounded. The commanding officer ordered his men that they had to hold on. They had no hope of relief at all. And he said that we have to do our best to slow the blighters down, to buy time so that defences could be organised on the far side of the river. And this they did admirably. They did it pretty much to the last man. And the entire regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French as a result. They hung on for several hours, as I said, almost to the last man. A few men had managed to escape, and they made a stand on the River Ain, on the far side of the River Ain, and then gradually retreated across the countryside over the next few days, pretty much as they'd done in March, this fighting retreat. As had happened in March, everyone of the Devonshires that was at Battalion HQ, those shoemakers and tailors and the battalion drums and all these sorts of people, they were scrambled to form a counter-attacking force of 40 men that was joined with these other ones. So almost every man of the Devonshires was involved in this desperate fight in the last week of May, and the vast majority of them were killed or taken prisoner. And unfortunately, Mark Farrow was one of the men to fall, probably 100 years ago tomorrow in the morning. He was buried on the battlefield in an unmarked grave somewhere near the Boer War. And they found him after the war. They identified him by his paybook, and he was reburied in Villebois Cemetery with full military honours. He was 38 years old and left a widow.
Father of all, remember your promise and look with love this day, we especially remember Mark Farrow and ask that you would hold him and all who suffered during the First World War, those who returned scarred by warfare, those who waited anxiously at home, and those who returned wounded and disillusioned, those who mourned, and those communities that were diminished and suffered loss. Remember too those who acted with kindly compassion, those who bravely risked their own lives for their comrades, and those who in the aftermath of war worked tirelessly for a more peaceful world. And as you remember them, remember us. O Lord, grant peace in our time and a longing for the day when people of every language, race and nation will be brought into the unity of Christ's kingdom. This we ask in the name of the same Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. As our Saviour taught us, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Would you please stand?
When you go home, tell them of us and say, the there tomorrow we gave out today.
God grant to the living grace, the departed rest, the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth, and all the world peace and concord. And to us and all God's servants, life everlasting. And may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be among you and remain with you all.